Welcome to today's Google Hangout, brought to you by Fire Engineering. We got a great show for you today, and we got a great lineup of guests. First off, we have the editor-in-chief, Bobby Halton, preparing for surgery, decided to come on today. We're honored to have the chief. And here with me in New Haven, I have the chief of North Haven, Chief, I call him PJ, and I'm always bad with names, so it's Andrew Chefsky, and Chief of Operations, Martes, from the North Haven Fire Department. On the other side of the camera, we have Steve from NFPA. Steve, if you could introduce yourself briefly, I would appreciate it. Okay, Steve's not with us yet. How about Steve Hamilton? Steve, can you introduce yourself quickly and your guest?
I'm Steve Hamilton. I'm a lieutenant with the Fort Jackson Fire Department, a former reserve deputy with the Richland County Sheriff's Department.
Okay, that was quick. And that was the least I've ever heard Steve Hamilton talk in my whole life. Can you introduce your guest?
And this is one of my fellow lieutenants. His name is Harry Stark. He's here with me. He's also with the Fort Jackson Fire Department. Harry has some unique experiences serving as a firefighter overseas during combat operations.
Well, thank you very much for joining our Google Hangout today. Both chiefs from North Haven, this was their first year out at FDIC, so they were talking about what a great experience it was. I'm going to let Chief Halton open up. Chief, today we're talking about hostile events, and in my 20 years in New Haven, they were far and few between, and now it seems that nationwide they're on the rise. Steve Hamilton and I wrote an article for Fire Engineering on police and fire interface and working together with your police department. And on the call that we had in New Haven with a barricade situation with 2 cops shot, with first responders giving medical care as the call unfolded, we thought we did a pretty good job, but there was room for improvement. Our chief, John Alston's doing a great job working with the police, but we still have a road to go here. And then we got called to assist at North Haven's barricade incident. And let me tell you, I have never been more impressed by the command presence of these 2 chief officers that we have on today than I saw in North Haven. The level of professionalism and the way they interact with the police department was the path that New Haven now, under the leadership of Chief Alston, is working to achieve. So if I can go to Bobby Halton first and just kind of lead us off with what's going on around the country with hostile events, and then we'll leave it to the chief here. Go ahead, Bobby.
Well, I think there's a couple of things to point out really quickly. To quote Benjamin Disraeli, there's damn lies, and statistics. And one of the things to always be cognizant of is that some instances of violence are in the increase, some instances of violence are on the decrease. But the perception of instances of violence is markedly higher, largely in part because of how we can connect technologically so quickly today. In other words, just yesterday's incident where the firefighters responded, the barricaded gunman who was eventually killed by the police as they entered, 5, 6, 10 years ago, it may have been a regional story, right? Barricaded gunmen, law enforcement officers went in and resolved it. Today, any incident becomes an international incident just because of our connectivity. That's good and it's bad. It's good because it allows us to capture more scenarios, which allow men like the guests we have today to develop scenario planning for future events. But we always keep in the back of our minds, as General Eisenhower taught us, we must plan relentlessly, but remember that all our plans are pretty much worthless after the first shot is fired. So you keep that in the back of your head, that it's always up to those on-scene people to innovate, create, deviate, adapt, adjust, add, detract. And so it takes officers like the 2 gentlemen that Frank has with him, Montes, John Montes and Steve Hamilton and his guest, because we need your expertise, we need your experience even more so, because that experience allows you to be innovative and creative and adaptive. Education will give you parameters, experience will give you ability. So as we look at the proliferation of violence, and the ability for violence to be instantly transmitted across the airwaves, the scrutiny that's then put on our guests to resolve it effectively, efficiently, and hopefully with a positive outcome, right? No loss of life, is elevated. And there's a plus and a minus to that. Once one of you are successful, and you generally are, everyone assumes that everyone else is going to be equally as successful. So there's a whole issue that we have to deal with in terms of zero defect. But the most important part of the conversation today is, what are some of the best practices that are going on out there? What are we looking at with the new 3000 standard that's been out there? What can we adapt, and what can we adopt from that locally to fit the communities that we serve in to the best effect, right? Steve and others, depending on your geographic location, you're going to have different levels of application of all different lessons learned and standards and best practices. So a best practice is a best practice regionally. A best practice is a best practice in context with what you have, right? An isolated gunman without a hostage, a gunman with a hostage, a knife attack, a vehicle attack, a chemical attack. All of these different violent events have different nuances. So it's going to be very interesting to hear what our guests feel is working well for them locally, and what folks can take away from the good work by the NFPA and others to investigate how can fire integrate best with law enforcement and other enforcement agencies to have successful and peaceful outcomes at these events.
I'm going to start with Chief PJ here from the North Haven Fire Department, because one thing I noticed when I got to the command post was there was a definite level of ease and a level of cooperation that I witnessed from yourself, your command presence, the Deputy Chief of Police command presence. And one thing that no matter what jurisdiction you're in, no matter whether you're following this standard or that standard, it doesn't start at the call. I know that relationship was built beforehand. And the key to any good unified command, and we see it across the country, where you get police and fire in the same room or the same car or the same trailer, and they're only together as long as the cell phone doesn't ring, and then they become unmarried and they go off, and then there's kind of that breakdown. And what I witnessed, even though I was on the campus for a little while, was that you guys were married together in a sense in making decisions and being aware of all the different moving pieces on the chessboard. So can you talk about the importance of not just saying you have a good relationship with the police department, but having a good relationship with the police department?
Yeah, that's a great point, and the chief brings up a lot of good points as well. I want to mention. You know, the big thing with this is I encourage all the viewers, if you think you have a good relationship with your police department, really peel that back and determine if that's the case or not. It's one thing to shake hands and respect each other. It's another thing to work together, and that's something that the North Haven Police and the Fire Department have a tradition and a history of doing for years. Is, you know, we get together on a weekly basis, the command staff. You know, if it's not formally, it's informally, and that paid off huge in this incident. So leading up to this incident, one of the reasons why it went as you described is we noticed we have the ability to see police incidents taking place in the town, which is unlike a lot of fire departments. We can see what officers are assigned, you know, in a brief synopsis as far as what the incident is. And so that kind of clued us off as something that had been going on for several hours. And then what happened was, because the police department has a great relationship with us, when they were getting to the point where now they're going to start putting officers in harm's way, they asked for the fire department to be present. We provide EMS in our department as well, and ALS, EMS. And so we provided assistance right away on scene to stand by while the police was beginning to do what they had to do. That clued off both myself and Deputy Chief of Operations Scott Martis, as we're listening to this, that something's going on and we should probably start paying a little more attention to this. So we both started going that direction. And the reason why this incident went so well is as soon as we arrived on scene, they were staging at a firehouse that was nearby the incident, putting their things together and so forth. We started to communicate with them and say, hey, what do you got? What's going on? What's your intel? And at this point, this is all still a police scene. There was a subject barricaded. They had been on scene for hours. They were trying to get vantage points. They were trying to get communication established, and they had been unsuccessful in doing so. So they were beginning to start making a push further onto the property.
And this was a credible threat, because I know there's some pending litigation. So I'll give the journalist view of it.
Yeah.
It started off as a hostage situation in some capacity. She was able to free herself, extricate herself. The fire department treated her, and then it turned into a police situation with the person barricaded.
Right. So there was very credible warnings that were provided to the police department. They were passing on us, which is why I think we're all kind of in a heightened state. So what happened is they began to move forward with their operations. And again, this being just a barricaded subject, they asked me, "Hey, come to the command post with us." And actually, I remember even saying to the deputy who was there at the time, saying, "Wow, that's pretty impressive that they're asking us to stay involved in their command post because this is still a police scene." So more or less out of curiosity, I stuck around for a while and started to kind of see how the SWAT team interacts and how they start communicating with each other. And then, we had an engine standing by, and I think that's a take home in this is surely out of luck. Really, we had an engine standing by. We were asked to maintain a presence for EMS standby, and typically what we know about SWAT operations is they go on for hours. So normally I would have another rescue calling staff to staff an ambulance. We call it a rescue fire ambulance at the station that we were staging at. I didn't have any spare ambulances available, so I manned an engine instead, which brought in 4 firefighters. That was a complete by chance move. I'm not going to lie. So we had an engine staged with 4 firefighters, and we planned on keeping them there for a number of hours until the threat diminished. And what happened as the scene progressed, when the explosion actually occurred, I had an engine right down the street. We were there. I was involved in the command post the entire time, so I knew the intel. I knew what we were considering to be threats. I knew the perimeter that had been established, and that's what allowed that incident to go so well. Now, take what could have happened had we not responded, had we not been invited to be part of that command post. We'd have been responding from wherever we were at that time, coming into a scene. Now you're trying to manage a fire, trying to manage exposure, trying to manage injuries, and at the same time you're being thrown all this intel. That's a lot to take in.
And this was, for those who didn't see it on the national news, this was a significant blast that took out essentially an entire tactical team that was attempting to make entry into the yard or entry into the barn behind the building with fire, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, I was 3 houses away when the blast occurred, and it shook the car.
Chief, I saw the video. What exploded?
So we don't know yet, and that's still part of the investigation. The structure at the end of the incident was at a state where we weren't able to tell what actually ignited, and we're still going through some footage and working with the state fire investigation unit to figure that out. That'll be some time before we know, and we may never know, to be honest. But the blast was significant enough that the police SWAT Bearcat vehicle, which we know kind of resembles almost a tank in some ways, actually lifted off the ground from the blast.
And that's a heavy vehicle. I mean, it's probably not as heavy as a cement truck, but Steve Hamilton might know the weights, but it's a significant, I saw the tracks it was leaving in people's yards. So it was definitely a heavy vehicle. Chief, what was your take on the incident?
Well, the first, we actually had a couple things really go well, I think, for us, and I think the chief alluded to the relationship prior. I have a really good relationship with the captain level and the deputy chief level of the PD, just on a personal level. He developed a very good personal working relationship. But when we were sitting there prior to the event, staging, we have a combination fire department in North Haven. So we have a career fire station in the center of town, and we have 3 outskirt stations. And they had picked this volunteer firehouse as their SWAT staging. So we actually had training that night at 7 p.m. for our volunteer department. So I called the volunteer captain and I said, I need you to get your crews and get the engines out of here so we can pretty much donate the firehouse to the SWAT team, because the guys are coming in plain clothes and they need a place to get changed and everything. So while we were sitting there staging, I was talking to the SWAT commander, Captain Glenn, and kind of getting the rundown on what they expected. So we kind of knew that, I think we knew that there were hazards in the backyard right away. And we kind of knew where their entry points were going to be even before we left. And then Paul, the chief, went to the command post, and I went to train with the volunteers. I made the determination that, okay, we're good. It's they do these every once in a while around the state, and I'll go train with the volunteers. And Chief Bob, you said something about instantaneous broadcasting. I learned that the barn had blown up on Facebook Live from one of the volunteers in my training, who said, "Chief, I think you want to take a look at this. There's I think the house blew up." And
But you know, that raises a great point. In other words, you know, the law enforcement, depending on the size of your community, is going to set up their system. But much like our systems, those incident commanders are really looking at the welfare and safety of their officers from the threats that they know about, right? But monitoring that social media, I know the bigger PDs can do that, but it might be a task that like we could pick up, you know, while they're overwhelmed. I mean, in a lot of communities, you might be able to say, hey, you know, I can monitor the social media channels if we learn how to do that in advance. I mean, because I know the cops do that, because the bad guys sometimes, bad guys are kind of interesting people. Sometimes they're on social media while they're being bad, and I know that wasn't this case, but that's a great piece of information. You know, monitoring social media today during a critical incident is really, really important. That's funny. Thank you for sharing that.
One of the challenges that
You weren't lucky. Don't ever say you were lucky, Chief. It was that diligent training and preparation and your highly skilled level of perception that made you make that call for that resource. You weren't lucky.
It also said that to me as well, and it worked out real well. And I think that's a good take home out of this is we've got to start building that relationship, and then we've got to start becoming, perhaps the fire department's got to start becoming part of every SWAT entry, every SWAT evolution. Perhaps not the training, because I understand that's going on, you know, on a bi-weekly basis, and a lot of our budgets can't support that. But you know, the opportunity presents itself every time the SWAT teams make an entry, for there to be a fire, whether it be from you know, a flash grenade that they're throwing in, a flashbang, or what have you, or something that the person within the home is doing. And being there on scene puts us so far ahead of the game. It really does.
And I would, if I could, just too, when we talk about, and I think you brought this up before, developing that relationship before the incident, the South Central Regional SWAT Team, which is comprised of the major suburbs that surround the city of New Haven, they were the first SWAT team in the state of Connecticut to take tactical fire paramedics, not police medics, fire-based medics, and put them on the stack. So the tactical stack of, you know, 5 or whatever, usually the 4th member is a medic, unarmed tactical medic going in on the entry. So their relationship and their respect and appreciation for the skills of a firefighter is it's reverberated to me all the time when I talk to them. Our guys go in and teach them how to take down doors. They teach them how to find hidden void spaces in building construction. Like there's a lot
so
of
the Halligan bar isn't just something they carry.
Exactly.
They're
They're purchasing equipment for the SWAT team from our vendor, you know, because they're learning a lot of information. So that kind of relationship, I think, also really helped them opening up to, hey, this is our first incident in this new kind of SWAT team, and you know, we need your help. And I think that definitely went a long way to the smooth transition.
There was a couple other challenges that I think any fire department could face, and I think North Haven handled it with grace. One thing is they had essentially a conflagration where it became about exposure protection. And we all know as chief officers, we want to increase our span of control and divide up and put chief officers in areas we can't see. But one thing that you did that I think was real effective is you didn't spread your resources too thin. What you did was you worked with neighboring departments, and for example, you put East Haven with East Haven's chief to take the rear of the building as exposure protection. So he was managing a limited number of personnel, and I know Steve later in the show will talk about this. You guys did a great job of limiting the number of personnel that were in those hot and warm zones, and by giving them East Haven, this is your sector, and we had a North Division and a South Division, it really helped break things up. So I thought that was very important. What was your thought process on that?
Yeah, so that's, you know, initially following the explosion, again, with that being strictly a police incident up until that point. So we didn't know what homes had been evacuated, if any, you know, surrounding the area. And now we didn't know what homes were burning or what structures were burning. So that presented the first conflict, was trying to figure out what's burning, what's at risk of burning, are there occupants trapped in neighboring homes? And that was perhaps the most challenging of that scene, was there were no police officers. There were some police officers, but there were limited police personnel left now. 9 of them were injured in a blast. The remaining officers that were on scene were still trying to maintain some degree of traffic control because it's a major road, and still starting to go in and start pulling police officers out. So for me to start moving personnel in, even the engine I had on scene, to start trying to determine what our next steps were, we had to look for an element of cover from SWAT. And we didn't have that for some period of time. So what we were able to do was navigate behind some homes to be able to put eyes on what was taking place, so we can start putting together, I guess in the book terms, our incident action plan. Without knowing that's what we were doing, that's what actually what we were visualizing and starting to figure out. Now, what began to happen is we had exposure to the north, exposure to the south, and exposure behind. I couldn't keep personnel, including myself, where we took a vantage point because we were too close to the incident. We were right across the street, and we honestly didn't know what further was going to happen. So we started to be able to retreat, kept somebody there to keep an eye on it, and we extracted him later on with a SWAT vehicle to get him back out of how close he was. But that was with limited resources, and now I've got potentially neighboring homes that are about to burn and people that are trapped. You take that inherent risk to be able to start to figure out what you need to do next. To be honest with you, I think we've got to start to embrace technology as well. We called for a drone within minutes of the explosion, and we knew we were going to start to begin to protect exposures when I could get SWAT team members there that were coming out from the surrounding towns to start being able to provide cover for our fire personnel to be able to go in and position those hose streams.
Which they did an unbelievable. The SWAT teams did an unbelievable job coordinating with the companies that were up front. From my personal experience there, I was very impressed with the demeanor.
And what happens is the drone arrives within, let's say, 15, 20 minutes from the next town over. And now we get this drone up in the air because there's no snipers that are left that are able to start giving me any kind of communication as far as what's burning. So we get the drone overhead, and we're starting to look at the exposures. The first exposure I moved to protect was the exposure on the south, which by all accounts is a closer exposure. So in theory, that's where you start. And as I'm watching the drone footage, live footage coming through, I'm watching the north exposure, which is further away, starting to burn. And now you had to kind of really start to make some decisions real fast, because I've got a cover team established for the south exposure, but now I'm watching the north exposure begin to burn. And a lot of that's radiant heat that was being given off by something that was burning on the property, and vinyl siding on the north exposure. So that drone saved at least one home, possibly others, without a doubt, because, we're starting off what we think is closer, not realizing that something else is going to take place. So we established very shortly a south division and north division to get the houses on either side, and then you're right, the east division. And to give you some perspective, the east division ended up being a neighboring street that backs up to this property, and it's really hard to try to describe necessarily what you want to take place to the East Haven fire chief who had made himself available and his department available to me. So one of the things I did was called him into the command post and brought up that drone footage and brought up an overhead GIS map of the neighborhood and said, here's where I want your ladder truck to position in a rear yard, back it all the way up, bring your tower overhead, and keep an eye on this whole scene and protect it. And being able to have those visual aids there was so much easier to call them in and spend 30 seconds than try to describe all that over the air.
When I initially pulled up, one of the other things that worked out really good, and any incident, it's command, cover, transportation corridor, which the police department needs to learn vitally, triage, treatment, and tracking. So when I pulled up, Chief Martis was running staging and working with the fire police, who are kind of like the forgotten ones, but the fire police did a tremendous job of keeping that transportation corridor open and using the firehouse as the staging location. You had running water, you had restrooms, and you were typesetting all your resources there. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of staging and trying to get that together?
So I mentioned before, I was training. So if you look at our town, it's about 7 miles across on the highway. I was off of exit 12, which is about, maybe 5 miles away from exit 9, which is where the incident went. So luckily, my office and the training center is right on the highway. So after the incident happened, I requested 2 of the apparatus that were in training to come with me, and I got in my car and I got there. As I pulled up to the firehouse, believe it or not, the thing I noticed was just the ambulances were everywhere, and they had no idea where to go. They're stopping at the first ambulance or running around, and so I kind of realized that whatever the chief and the police department had going on up the street, we really needed to get a handle on the situation. And I actually kept thinking about Sandy Hook. I read some case studies on Sandy Hook, and they kept talking about how the corridor of travel got blocked and how there was no coordination between the EMS providers, and there were ambulances literally stuck in front of the school for days. And had they even gotten a victim out, they wouldn't have been able to transport them. So I just stopped my car and on the side of the road, and I was like, well, this is where I'm needed. It's probably more fun to go into the burning building, but somebody got to put out the house next door too. So I stopped. I called the chief on the radio. I told him I was there, and I was going to assume staging, control of staging. And then knowing that we had fire, I didn't know exactly what was going on. And I hope everybody can appreciate the sheer chaos, because while the chief is trying to figure out the structure fire component, the police officers are engaged in a massive tactical evacuation of injured officers. So they've got a limited number of officers, and they've got men wounded, and that they're trying to find a place to evacuate, and they're screaming for medics to come to the back. So I basically started to, in my mind, kind of put together what we needed, and we made the determination pretty quick. I had a help from a young firefighter named Angel, one of my volunteers, that we wanted to make sure we had 9 ambulances in staging at all times, and I wanted a third alarm assignment parked on the side of the road. So we basically wanted 7 engines, 3 trucks, 9 ambulances, and then a couple additional paramedic units available. And we got it. Hamden Fire sent a paramedic first responding ambulance. I had my truck and my entire on-duty shift there. I had every volunteer engine in town with the exception of a continuity of service. The chief of East Haven came to the staging area, and he basically said, what do you need? And I said, well, do you have a truck that you can send me? He said, yes. I got word that New Haven had sent one of their trucks and their squad. So we were able to coordinate with the fire police lieutenant. His name is Kurt Andrews. I told him what I needed to control the flow. They did a phenomenal job, because you got to also picture 25 or 30 patrol cars racing through the barricade to get to the scene. They did a phenomenal job. They kept the corridor open. We set up staging roads. And it probably all happened, Chief, within, 10 minutes, 15 minutes that we kind of had a pretty good plan. And then once I had it, I'm the kind of guy where I'm a visual learner, right? So once I saw it on the dry erase board and my command board, and I could kind of picture what my personnel was, it was everything you learned in the classroom from there. Command would call me and say, I need 2 more ambulances, and we'd send 2 ambulances up, and they'd pick up patients, and then we'd send them 2 more. And, he needed a Division East setup. We sent East Haven's engine, East Haven's truck, East Haven's chief. So it worked out that way.
And eventually you even brought a gator to the scene to help move personnel. And we called for an overpack drum, because there was flammable liquids going into the drainage system, which drains to the Long Island Sound. So they were able to come up, do their task, and go right back to staging. So remember, you're either at the command post, you're in staging, you're assigned, or you're in rehab. There's no other place for you to be at an incident like this. So I think that keeping the control. One thing that is a lesson for departments out there that I think we can do a better job at is, especially because radio communications were a problem between all the agencies, is we married with staging. If you have multiple agencies, we married a New Haven battalion chief with yourself. And then you got to remember, if that person gets relieved, you can't leave until someone else replaces you. And the only thing that I think that could have been done a little bit better is, once the situation stabilized with removing that tactical team that was injured, we could have got a New Haven battalion chief, yourself, and a police officer married at staging the same way you did it in the command post. And that would have helped accountability, because we had so many police agencies there. I mean, Quinnipiac Avenue was lined for at least,
hours,
a couple miles, it looked like, of cop cars. So when we set up command position, I think that's something to think about, is can you place a police officer and whatever fire crews and kind of marry them together is something that we can look at. Go ahead, Bob.
A couple of things. I think the audience, and as we bring in our experts, what's the size of your community? How big is your police department? How big combination fire department? And then so population, law enforcement numbers, fire numbers, what kind of community are we looking at?
Yeah, so we're a population sitting outside, just outside New Haven, 25,000 nighttime population, daytime swells to 50. High concentration of industry and commercial and transit. The police department's got a staff in the 50s, and the fire department has a staff, 8 on duty, career on duty at a time. It's essentially been the same staffing since 1974. We run about just under 5,000 runs out of one station, career house.
So you're more the norm than than you could imagine, right? I mean, you're a typical American community with a very almost standard template law enforcement fire contingent, which I think is outstanding. I mean, I think obviously you live in a wonderful community, and they're doing a great job of managing it. So, my point being that so often we see these things happening and we think, well, that's never going to happen here. And the reality is it happens everywhere. And the ability to respond is only predicated on how, as what Paul said earlier, how much you're willing to invest in terms of time to develop the relationships, to develop the assets that you can deploy, whether it's tactical medics, whether it's robotics, whatever it is. But and they're always scalable, right? I'm sure if you asked the initial law enforcement officer who responded, he would have told you, I didn't have enough. And then if you talk to the boss at the end, he probably would have said it was managing too much stuff at the end, right? It's always that incredible bell curve that we see that goes like this, hits the point, the sweet spot, and then just goes insane with too many assets that become a management issue. So great story, interesting, conclusion to it with the explosion. So I'd love to, just in the interest of time, bring in the experts that we have available with us. Obviously, John Montes, who's been working diligently on 3000. We have Steve Hamilton and his guests, and not to critique at all, but to kind of build on all the great stuff you've shared, whether it's traffic control, fire police, resources, drilling, just building those relationships, right? Letting law enforcement know, hey, whatever we have is yours. We're here for you, and likewise they for us. And I would add, Chief, that perhaps we should dispatch a law enforcement officer at every fire. The traffic control, support, all kinds of great things, even PR. Most of them are eloquent in terms of dealing with the media. They know what they can say and what they can't say. So great points. And Frank, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, and then we're going to move to our expert panel. One last thing that I want to say about the incident. One, it concluded safely, and all 3 exposures were safe, including the exposure that was on fire that you noticed from the drone.
Yep.
So the exposures were safe. I also want to point out one thing, because I've seen it happen in the New Haven incident, and I saw it happen in the North Haven incident. Their police officers, as much as we love them, are not as used to working within the incident command system as firefighters. And something happened, and there's no rank in the incident command system, there's only function. So you had a lieutenant that was in charge of the Southern Division when I got moved up to that forward position as safety. And we had a SWAT team working with us. And all of a sudden, a individual from the SWAT team comes up with an M4, all motivated, given that Steve Hamilton type of voice. And he says, light the front of the building up now. The sniper can't see something. And as I was putting my hand on the lieutenant gently to say, don't do it, bring it through command, I didn't have to say anything. The lieutenant didn't even acknowledge him other than to say, hold on, and got on the radio and immediately asked command, can I light up the front of the building? And command came back and said no. In the New Haven incident, we had them pull out the shooter that they shot, and the SWAT team called up our medics who were behind cover when the building wasn't cleared yet, and the fire chief had to say, hold on a second, is the second floor cleared? So I got to give your lieutenant and your incident command training for your department, chief, because he wasn't intimidated by a guy with an M4 it seemed like I think 90% of the people I know would have said, light up the front of the building,
Yeah,
and
sure.
then told command. So that's an important lesson. Just because a police officer tells you something with a gun, you still got to bring it through command. And I will go to Steve Hamilton with that. So he should be commended for that. I was very impressed.
Yep.
Steve Hamilton.
So yeah, a couple of points.
Steve from NFPA.
The drone piece was big. Drone technology is expanding in your ability to use it on an incident, giving you that real world intel. Any law enforcement incident where you have barricaded subject or you have direct threat issues, and that hot zone is going to be ever expanding, which, by the way, the zones are designated by the aggressor, not by us. The aggressor is the one who's going to set your zones. All you're doing is merely gathering intelligence to identify where those waypoints are. But the drone is a good piece in order to capture that data. And one of the things we do here, or I use very frequently, I know Harry uses it a lot, is Google. We use Google Maps all the time. I can pull up Google Maps knowing I'm going to an area where I have a long response time. I can tell you where the hydrant is by going to Google Maps and doing the street view and scaling down the street. I can look at hydrants. I can look at cars that have been parked in the area, gather some intelligence as to whether or not a building looks abandoned or occupied, et cetera. There's lots of information that can be gleaned from that.
It's funny you bring that up, because that's exactly, as soon as I got there, that's what I did. I took my iPad out of my car and I brought up Google Maps and the truck operator, and I looked, because I knew the address, but I didn't actually know the house. So I had to see the house so I know which roads to get from staging to the house, how we can get around, how we get back to it. So it's fantastic to bring that up, because I'm going to tell you, in a real world 5-second chaotic scenario, boom, you got all the information.
And based on the intelligence that we use, I know here in the greater Columbia area, window bars are huge. Right? You'll find window bars all over the place. And where law enforcement may be set up and they're waiting on a barricaded individual, they're doing something, and we're looking at Street View, Google Maps, and things like that, I can turn around and say, hey, are you guys aware that there are window bars on this structure? And we're pretty proficient in removing window bars, but I don't know where tactical teams may be with that. So you can start communicating intelligence and things like that back and forth to each other using that kind of information. The other thing that I was aware of, I know we didn't touch on it, but I was aware of it through following communications with Chief Ricci, both in the evening and the next day, was the way that you use the ladder truck tactically in order to put water on fire and then maintain a distance and maintain some hard cover between you and the target building where you might have had a subject or multiple subjects. And with that is great. We had a class yesterday with the Richland County Sheriff's Department, SRT squad leader, and he talked about using ladder trucks for Overwatch, platform trucks, and putting a SWAT sniper in a platform truck for Overwatch for various different things, special events, anything you may have along the lines of that. And previously in classes I've discussed where you have issues with civil unrest, or you have issues where you have to put water on a fire and you have concerns about putting hose on the ground, things like that. Your airport crash trucks are a wonderful resource if you can position them in such a manner. If you have a National Guard element within the state, they have tactical firefighting trucks, which is like an airport truck, and it has many nuances to it. It's used to working in a combat environment, and some of them, depending on what their status is when they've come back from deployment, they could be up armored. So law enforcement has shields, ballistic shields that they use. Lots of times you can put those in the cab, in the windows, and give a police officer a quick 5-minute crash course on positioning the apparatus, and you're protected without putting firefighters in gear, stretching hose, and getting down into the outer edge of that warm hot zone.
Yeah, we did that, and you're right, and that's something that we used 2 rail trucks for that incident. One to maintain on the south and then one on the east. And that east side division certainly did provide that vantage point to ensure that, I understand that we're working. We had all of our personnel setting up unmanned devices and then taking shelter behind their apparatus. The intel coming out of the FBI was they were concerned about additional explosions. So all of our, if you monitor the radio frequencies, you hear me say at least once, all personnel must maintain helmets and PPE, because we were worried about that. And you do have that inherent risk again, where you have to position the apparatus, you have to position the unmanned hoses, but you're doing it with a great deal of situational awareness to something that our guys typically don't work with. We've never been exposed to this kind of incident before. You can think about it, but you don't do it.
One point to make before we bring in Montes, I'd love to hear his take, especially in relation to what we're doing with 3000. But some terminology that's important. Remember, law enforcement, when they're getting trained up, they talk about perimeters, outer perimeter, inner perimeter, and then they'll talk about a kill zone. So when we're talking hot, warm, and cold, I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist to figure out what that means, right? So I don't think anybody who's a ICS jihadist needs to go to confession now because they used inner outer perimeter. So you hear law enforcement using those terms, you should be aware of what they mean. The other word that came up quite frequently in this conversation, I think needs to be discussed for the audience, is the word concealment and cover. You can be concealed but not covered. In other words, you can be out of view but still vulnerable. When you're covered, that means that you can't be struck by debris or a bullet. So when we're talking about field of fire also, which a lot of civilians don't understand unless they have military training, the field of fire widens, think about like an ice cream cone or a big V, right? The shooter's field of fire, as it goes out in all directions, becomes wider. So you always need to be cognizant of what the field of fire is for your opponent. And as Steve said so eloquently, your opponent, in this case, the bad guys, they define the perimeters. They define where the kill zone is, and the kill zone, depending on the weapon, it can go out 1.5 miles. I mean, depending on what you've got. Think of the Texas bell tower shooting, a high-powered rifle with a scope. So, cover is different than concealment. So, if you're behind something but you don't think it can stop a round, if you're just behind drywall and plaster, you might want to let the cops know, hey, I'm concealed, but I'm not covered. And there's a lot of misconceptions. A lot of people think that you get down behind the engine block of a vehicle that you're covered. There's a little thing called skip shooting that kind of blows that theory away. All the bad guy has to do is take a round and ricochet it off underneath the car, and it's going to come up and take you. And we've got numerous examples of where officers have been hit behind the engine block trying to use that as cover. So just be very careful and talk to your law enforcement officers when you do your training and say, what is good cover? What is good concealment? And then if you have a really good relationship during the event, ask their safety officer to evaluate, are my people, correctly protected? And they'll let you know, say, oh no, dude, trust me, we think this guy has this, or we think this gal has that, and they are not, covered. We're going to move them back, or we're going to put them here. So important terminology. Montes, I'd love to get your take on this incredible conversation and how it relates to the good work that you're doing.
Well, first of all, thank you all so much for having me. Very excited to participate today. Just an amazing story, and thank you, Chiefs, for sharing. So much of what everyone's talking about today relates right back to what's in NFPA 3000. And when we look at how 3000 affects responders and affects the fire service, when you talk about things related to pre-planning, understanding capabilities, understanding expectations and roles and responsibilities, all those factors that factored into the response that the Chiefs are describing, all of that relates right back to 3000. And I'll give you some examples. The use of ground equipment and setting up a distance, the use of a ladder to provide distance from the incident, using the light story, sending that request to command, unified command, all of that is in 3000. So much of it can relate back to what's in the standard. And, you know, Chiefs, you guys kind of surprised me when you said we should have a police officer come out to every alarm or every first alarm. You know, that's a great idea. You know, in the systems I worked in, when I worked in Boston, for example, we took advantage of our special events as an opportunity to practice unified command. We took it as an opportunity to practice area command for the marathon, in all of our other disaster plans. And using your special events, using your routine events as opportunities to learn and train for when you have these complex dynamic events, you know, that's the core of 3000, having those conversations ahead of time. The last time you want to be sharing a business card with your police counterparts or your EMS, if it's separate from your fire department, is at the scene of a major incident. You want to know and have those relationships long ahead. And the planning requirements in the new standard, the competency requirements about knowing the local tactics, local policies, local procedures, and expectations across departments, those are the things that are needed and clearly are effective, as demonstrated by the Connecticut case.
I got a question here on Twitter. Let me see. I got questions and comments. It seems like everybody loves the gator. How'd you get it there? Because that seems to be popular on social media right now. See, leave it to firefighters. It's not about working with
the gator.
Hey, that's cool.
Yeah. So while I'm setting up this staging, when I command, my phone rings, and it's every off-duty fireman that lives in town has now gone to fire headquarters and is calling me to say, "Hey, what do you need? What do you need?" So as I said, well, hold on, I'm just kind of getting a handle on the incident. Lieutenant Brian Marino, who was the officer that called me, goes, "Well, we have the gator here." I'm like, "Oh, great. Put 2 guys in it, load it up with water, and drive it down here. But tell them they have to go down Rock Road. They can't come down Quinnipiac." So, yeah, 2 firefighters showed up in the gator. They went the long way. They came around. They probably brought me 15 cases of water, which was great because it was something that I knew we were going to need. And that gator was the hardest working apparatus of the fire department. It shuttled every ATF agent. It shuttled the hazmat team from the squad with the buckets. I mean, it just went back and forth. I literally had 1 firefighter assigned as the chauffeur, and they were just loading that gator up back and forth. It worked out really well because it was a good half mile. Yeah, I would say it's a good half-mile walk from where we had set up staging to where the command post was. So
I'd like to get Lieutenant Stark's opinion on what the Chiefs briefed from New Haven and East Haven. What did you think of that?
Awesome. I'm just kind of broaching some of this in the civilian sector and kind of really getting into it. And I think it's typical of almost every American and a lot of people in the fire service now are, you know, like Chief was saying a little while ago, it's, you know, small town USA, you know, this could happen in any fire station, any town, you know, there's really no demographic lines or anything or population lines that differentiate any of these incidents. So it's one of the things I've seen. I had some combat operations, you know, several years back in the mid 2000s, not long after 9/11 and such. And over there, it's like we know when I was in the military, you know the threat is there, so you're vigilant, you're looking for it. I think the problem now is that we're, you know, like Chief was saying a minute ago too, the people are not used to being vigilant to those things, and I think it's just the opposite. I think we need to be more vigilant now as responders, and I think we need to breed that culture to be more vigilant, watching around constantly. Stuff in Steve's class, you know, just keeping your head on a swivel, come up to any scene, because you never know what can get sideways on you. So it's interesting to say the least. I was going to ask you guys too from North Haven, Chiefs. Do you think that it's reactive in a way? It seems like you guys had a great relationship, like you were saying, with your police and stuff like that. But with the incident actually happening, do you think now that the reactive side of it is like the for lack of a better term, the oh crap factor? Is it more of a reality now as far as planning and putting some more stuff together?
Yeah, you know, I had a long meeting yesterday because this incident, while it occurred now a couple of weeks ago, but we're living it every day still in one, you know, variation or another. In the conversation yesterday with the leadership of the police department, 3 of them were there. it's just that, you know, we're looking back, we're kind of doing self-reflection. You honestly start to kind of forget about certain things. Like I forgot all about you saying to turn the light off. And I remember now when I listen to the tapes, we had that conversation at command post, but all of us now looking back are saying, yeah, you know something, that's what made this work so well. And a number of other factors as well, but really when you core down to it, that's what made this incident go the way that it did, was that underlying relationship that we all appreciate. You know, and it's I think it's important. And you know, one of the things that got brought up before, and that I can appreciate from the PD as well, and I think Chief, you brought this up, was the social media aspect. There was somebody Facebook living the entire incident before the explosion. So if that's giving away all the location of everybody, what the tactics are, what's being said, what's being done, and that was a threat. You know, and then that worked against us as well. A short time later, unfortunately, I think it did work against us, was everybody started to show up. And you talk about unified command. Unified command is great on paper, but you got to figure out who belongs in a command post. And that was part of the issue, was every agency starts showing up, state, federal, and you're looking around trying to figure out who's in charge.
It was like alphabet soup.
It really was, yeah. I mean,
everywhere.
yeah. And that was a case out of Sandy Hook.
God forbid the mayor shows up.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, and that's, you expect that, right? But the you know, everybody started showing up, and that's what happened. And then, you know, we start having road closure issues. You start having, you know, cars being parked everywhere. One thing we were complimented on was our fire police, which is an antiquated service of the fire service. I mean, it just is. We have them on a tradition, and there are about a dozen dedicated seniors, for the most part seniors. I'm gonna get in trouble for saying that with some of them. That maintain scene security, you know, at scenes like this. And you think about that, the police all went and had to do what they had to do, and the fire police were left protecting the scene. And one thing we were complimented on was our scene access control, because, I mean, talk about looking at somebody with an M4 in your hand. I mean, I remember the story from one of them saying that there was a gentleman who showed up from the feds and says, I'm with heavy weapons. And fire police guy says, well, get your ID. And sent the guy back to his car to get his ID to let him back through the entry point. I mean, so there's a lot that happened. And I've looked through NFPA 3000, and I think this is something that I'm going to have to continue to look at and learn from. And to my deputy chief's credit, God, 2 weeks before this incident, we're walking on FDIC together for our first times there. And naturally, he goes up to a vendor for vests, and we're walking away. And I said to him, hey, I'm not there yet. I said, I'm just not there yet. Give me some time. There's a lot of other things I need to start worrying about buying, and I'm eating it now.
Well, and I wouldn't beat yourself up yet. You know what I mean? I don't think, I get that point, but there's a lot of law enforcement folks, and it depends on your community, right? We're going to say if the firefighters are wearing vests, they're in the wrong place. So it depends on, so maybe for your community, vests are the right way to go, and I think that's important. But remember, it's a pretty parochial thing when we start talking about levels of what is your level, and because there may be communities where, you know, the law enforcement folks are going to be state police or sheriff's officers, and they're going to say, no, guys, we don't want you to have vests. We want you to be staged in the firehouse or something like that. But you never know. And I guess any level of protection that we can get people is good. So if you can afford the vests, I mean, I'm not against them. I'm just saying I wouldn't beat myself up, because it's a really wickedly complex question. The other thing that I did learn years ago, I used to teach a course called Critical Incident Management for law enforcement executives with the U.S. Department of State and some other private companies and as contractors. And one of the things that they learned years ago was, if you have a police recruit class available, they put them on the perimeter and they tell them, don't let anybody in, and they won't. They will follow directions to the letter. I mean, they will stop literally the governor and say, sorry, dude, you're not on the list. Whereas a law enforcement officer, a firefighter who knows the politics and the situation after a few years are going to let people like that through, right? They're going to recognize them. But if you can get those rookie kids out there, much like the fire police did, and you tell them, don't let anybody through, they won't let anybody through. And we heard dozens of great stories like that. Whereas if you can find, and that's why the perimeters, you know, we laughed a little bit about the perimeters. For us hot, warm, cold zones, we forget that those cops out there on those perimeters really need to have the ability to stop all that traffic, and they want to redirect it. So that's a critical piece of success. And I'm really happy to hear, it may be a way for us to reinvigorate some of our fire police folks across the country.
I'll go to Steve with this, but I think it's important on the vest thing because some people think that all bulletproof vests are created equal, and the normal police officer vest, the rifle round will go right through it. He put it out in his DVD. We did it for the Globe PPE DVD because police officers know what the vest can stop and won't stop. So it's not as simple as putting on a vest. And if somebody shoots you in the face, your vest really doesn't matter either. So Steve, would you like to speak to that? Because I'm sure there's some departments here where the worst thing that could happen is they go to the police department and say, give us your old vest, because don't most of them expire? Steve, can you speak to that?
Yeah, so they're manufacturer specific. Some of the vests, most soft Kevlar. So glad you mentioned that. Most soft Kevlar like this. This expires at 5 years. Okay, and this is just an outer carrier. When you unzip this, you'll find a white, flexible, hard type material, rigid material inside of there. Those expired about 5 years. They have the same limitations and issues that bunker gear does. Sunlight starts to degrade them, bleach, things like that will degrade them, so you need to protect them from those things. Manufacturers have now come out with hardened plates. Some of those hardened plates don't expire for 10 years or somewhere in that range. So they've extended them out a little bit. Simplest terms possible. Hardened plates, under most circumstances, stop rifle rounds and all pistol rounds. The soft armor I just showed you, there some pistol rounds, it depends on what the rating is. It's going to vary. Some pistol rounds it'll stop, rifle rounds it won't at all, and it'll fly right through it. So you have to have an idea kind of what your threat is when you're outfitting people with PPE. The other thing is that the soft armor by the manufacturer's recommendations has to be measured specifically to the user. They will sell it to you with A sizing. They will say, hey, we can do A sizing, but in the fine print of their material, it'll say this is supposed to be fitted to the individual wearer. So there's a legal thing with that. But with the hardened plates, I'm giving you rifle protection. They are A sizing. And the only thing that I'm necessarily having a reoccurring cost in would be the plate carrier itself, which is just that blue outside covering. And that's all you're really going to be dealing with. But as we discussed in NFPA, and John Montes can discuss it further, what we came up with for the body armor portion of the standard was painful, horribly painful to try to get to that level of what are we going to recommend. And remember that the standard is not active shooter and that's it. The standard is active shooter and hostile event. So John, you want to speak on that for a minute?
Yeah, so if I can jump in. The other thing that's important is the standard was set as a bare minimum. That's the floor. And the floor that they chose was level 3A if you're operating in a warm zone. They did that based on a lot of input, both from the NIJ, from the law enforcement community, even from NIST. They set it as a bare minimum, but we learned a lot about vests and ratings of vests through this process. And you can take parts of level 2 vests and combine them and make them higher protection levels than a level 3A. So while they set the floor, like Steve said, they also set the floor based on setting that bare minimum, but based on the information that they were provided, and that it's not just for active shooter, it's for also hostile. One last thing on the vests too is the standard specifically says that if an incident commander feels that it is safe to do so and that there is an opportunity to perform some sort of life-saving activity, they can deviate from the vest requirement as long as it's investigated and reported in the after-action report as to what happened and how it went. So they even gave that option in there to say, you know what, the commanders need to make these decisions and they are empowered to do so.
John, we're at that witching hour at 2 o'clock. Can you give our viewers the information on where they would find the standard, just in case somebody's trying to Google it right now? Can you say it or give a website for them?
Absolutely. www.nfpa.org/3000. If you click on the news tab, there's a fact sheet that you can print out and share with your law enforcement so they can learn more about what's in it without having to read the whole thing. There's some videos on there. There's an online training. So we're really trying to do a lot to give everybody the resources they need.
Thank you. This is a real large topic. I want to thank both chiefs from North Haven. Again, I've never been more impressed with the way you coordinated it, and it really is a community that you find everywhere in America. We were honored to get you fuel for your fire trucks at 2 o'clock in the morning and fuel everything up for you. You know, there's no small players, and as chief of operations to take over staging, again, in these types of incidents, there's no small job, and you took over a job that you knew needed to be taken over as logistics, and it really helped run the whole incident. So I've been real impressed. Bobby, if you want to say the last word, and then we're out today, and we'll probably have our panel back again because we're just kind of scratching the surface. And it's thank you to Fire Engineering, FDIC, and Editor-in-Chief Bobby Halton for joining us today. Bobby,
well, I look forward to reading the chief's article when he gets some time after the things calm down a little. I think it'll make a great read, lessons learned and capture, so we can archive it, you know, and as the evolution of this incredibly dynamic industry continues to address this particular issue and set of issues, right? Also, I'd like to remind everyone that the June 25th, the call for presentations closes. So if you'd like to be at FDIC as an instructor this year, please get your paperwork in. But it's a hard shutdown on June 25. So I know that seems a long way off, but it'll be here before you know it. I'd like to thank all of our guests today. What a wonderful group. Chiefs, the work you did out there is absolutely amazing. It truly shows the level of professionalism that your community is blessed with, and you're two great representatives, eloquently spoken, incredibly well poised, and clearly extremely professional and competent. And so my hat's off to you. Steve and our new friend, want to hear more from you guys. I know there's so much more that you can contribute, and we look forward to that. You know, I just can't thank you enough for what you do and how you support fire engineering, FDIC, and everything else. And as always, Frank, you're an inspiration. You're an amazing guy. Pretty phenomenal character all the way around. So I look forward to seeing you next week. Next week's going to be an interesting hangout. It's going to be Bobby Halton and some surprise guests. We're going to do a very unique hangout. So I encourage you to tune in and see what kind of characters I hang out with when I'm hanging out. So look forward to seeing you next week. Again, thank you so much to everybody, and be careful out there.
Thank you. Have a great day.